Hi, everyone. Welcome to Poet. I'm Radha Marcum, and today I have the pleasure of talking to poet Cyrus Cassells, author of Is There Room for Another Horse on Your Horse Ranch? Before I introduce Cyrus, I'd like to invite you to become a subscriber of the Poet to Poet newsletter on Substack if you aren't already. Just go to poettopoet.substack.com and subscribe for free. In it, you'll find interviews like this one, plus helpful ideas on writing and publishing books of poetry. So today, again, I'm thrilled to be talking once again with Cyrus Cassells. Cassels' profound work explore identity, history, and the human experience with a distinctive voice that combines lyrical intensity with meticulous craftsmanship. Cassels is best known for his 10 books of poetry, which have earned numerous accolades, including the William Carlos Williams Award from the Poetry Society of America, a Lambda Literary Award, and 2 Pulitzer Prize nominations. Additionally, Cassels has held fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, National Endowment of the Arts, and the Rockefeller Foundation. From 2021 to 2022, he was appointed Poet Laureate of Texas, and he is a Regents Professor and University Distinguished Professor of English at Texas State University, where he was awarded recently the Presidential Excellence Award. So, Cyrus, welcome back to Poet.
Thank you so much.
So I'm really excited to be talking about this newest book of yours. Is there room for another horse on your horse ranch? And I thought we could start our discussion of that with a little reflection on the roots of the book. So in one of the descriptions of the book, Richie Hoffman says he describes you as a 19th century romantic poet. And he says, who else could write work so unapologetic in its appetites, so sexy and urbane at the same time? Here we see him at his best brazen, erotic, confident, and full of verve. So how do you think about the new work? So that's from an outside perspective, but as the poet, what are you seeing as the roots of this work?
Well, it's definitely the most high-spirited and joyful of all my books. So, and in a way, it is a kind of sequel to my third book, Beautiful Senor, where I was openly celebrating same-sex relationships. That was in an Italian context. The new book is in sort of a cosmopolitan context. Some of it's set in Asia as well as Europe and different parts of the world there. So the thing about this book was it came from old scraps of my poetry, completely from old scraps. I had a fellowship in Taos in January of 2019, and in the middle of the snowstorms and the snow, I kind of stumbled on old bits of poetry that I had never quite used. And I thought, well, wait a second, these lines are, there's something to them. There's some energy and juice here, some vitamins here. So I began playing around with these scraps, and I started in early January. I had 2 weeks at the Mabel Dodge Foundation, and then I kept writing till the very end of February, and I didn't quite know what I had. I thought it sort of tumbled out of me very quickly, right? And I thought, well, is this really a book? I don't know what this is exactly. So as a kind of lark, I sent it in to the National Poetry Series, and they chose it as a finalist for um, the award. And since I'd won the National Poetry Series with my first book, it wasn't like I needed to win again. I was just like, okay, is this actually a book? So in June, they called and said, you're a finalist. Um, if you want to just to be aware of this, and we'll make our decision in August and all of that there. So it was a most improbable kind of process that I went through with this book. I had written maybe 1 or 2 poems before the big period of snow and my fellowship in Taos. And what I liked about them was that they were more conversational than my work had been previously. They were more sort of down to earth and had kind of everyday elements and probably more humor. I I mean, I think of the book as being a sort of sexy after 60 kind of, you know, we're
Yeah.
still alive here, people. It's not over.
It's a lot more sophisticated than that, but
I know, I know. It's just when I like to tell people it's a sexy after 60 book, right? But that's kind of it. I mean, it wasn't anything I planned at all. What made it even more complicated was I spent the summer of 2019 in Spain and Italy, and I wrote the other book, The World That the Shooter Left Us.
Mhm.
And because of the buoyancy of this book, I think I was able to write through the intensity of the other book, which is about the stand your ground killing of my assistant's father, right?
Right.
So sometimes it seemed to be a period in my life where things just sort of roll through me, just pass through me very quickly, like a thunderstorm or a shower or something. But this is super pleasant,
Mm.
right? Um, and what else I wanted to say about it? I wrote almost all of it the first 8 weeks, 2 months. And then when I found out it was a finalist, I thought I'm going to strengthen the book, and I added some poems and lines and things. So what happened was they announced me as a finalist, and Martha Rhodes, who runs Four Way Books, says, "What's this horse book you have?" They said, "Can I take a look at it?" I said, "Sure." And I didn't think anything of it because we were friends and we had read poetry together at the Fine Arts Work Center and in Provincetown the year before. So I wasn't thinking about her as a publisher. So a couple of days later, she wrote, "Oh, I want to publish this," right? And so since I already had Southern Illinois Press as my publisher, I had to figure out, okay. So I had to also offer it to John Tribble
Mhm.
summer. And then I thought, well, why don't I offer, and she seemed to be more responsive and more on the wavelength of the Horse Ranch book. I mean, he's the only person I ever met who thought that the title was where.
Mm.
The title comes from a come on
Mm.
this young blonde bartender gave me at a Jory Graham reading at the Canadian Embassy in Paris. And I thought it was the most adorable, funny thing. So I was trying to describe to him the writing fellowship that I had in Texas. In exchange for mucking stalls in my friend's ranch, I got room and board to work for a semester near my university, right? So I was trying to explain to him, and then he turned and said, in a very French accent, "Is there room for another horse on your horse?" I thought, wow, that's really adorable. But I don't have time to respond to this one. You know, Jory and I were old friends. It's like, I'm at this official event. I'm not gonna like lure you away from bartending there, right? So that's what it comes from. And I just thought it was I had written that poem as it's kind of a prose poem at an earlier period. And I thought, well, this kind of matches these new poems from scraps that I'm doing. And it just happened super, super fast. And of course, the shooter book happened so fast, I can hardly remember having written it.
Mm. Mhm.
So usually it used to take me, I would say 3 to 4 years to write a book of poems, right? And then my latest book, which I'm finishing up right now in Italy, I started in June of last year and it's getting done like what, a year and a half later? Barely a year and a half later.
Yeah.
So there's something that kind of, I've never been much of an occasional poet.
Mhm.
I tend to write in cycles.
Mhm.
And sometimes these cycles come on very powerfully and decisively. So I was unable to work on anything else but this new Italian book, um, which is called A Poet is Cousin to Life Itself, and is inspired by mostly by Pasolini and Cesare Pavese, the Northern Italian poet, who so in an earlier period, I'd done a book called More Than Peace and Cypresses, where I'd taken some of Pavese's poetry and done kind of versions of them or pushed off of certain language from his poems, which I've done again. And then I've written poems inspired by the films of Bernardo Bertolucci, um, who I got a chance to be around. I mean, I was an actor in Rome in the 90s. I was an English language actor, and I had a English language acting coach and an agent, and I did some um, not so memorable movies, but I did get hired to be an English patient.
Mm,
But, this Sylvester Stallone disaster movie called Daylight. And
mm.
in both cases, my scenes kept getting delayed and I didn't end up getting to be in the movie. But of course, it was an actor's nightmare because English Patient won 9 Oscars, including
Right.
Best Picture.
Right.
I was supposed to have a scene with Colin Firth, who eventually won the Oscar for Best Actor. So it was like,
Wow.
how did this not happen? Kind of thing. But I did a little bit of dubbing in English, right?
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm involved in Rome now is that I have my closest friend is a very, very talented actor, and we're in the beginning stages of trying to put together some kind of English language theater here in Rome, which has never quite been successful in the past, but there's so many people coming to Rome now. We're considering how we might put forth a viable English language theater company here.
Mhm.
So that's kind of floating around a little bit right now. I'm very open to consulting, and so my training was not to be a poet and a teacher per se. My training was to be an actor.
Mhm.
But what happened was my final month in college at Stanford, my acting coach, who was a remarkable woman, came to me and she said, "Oh, I'm so worried about you, Cyrus." I said, "Why? Why?" He says, "I'm worried about you because I think you're a writer and an actor. I think that's the direction you need to go."
Hmm.
She said, "I know I gave you an A+ in acting, but I think you're," and she was right, right? Because like 2 years later, I won the National Poetry Series. But of
Mhm.
course, I was crushed. I'd spent my, young life studying to be on stage and to be in films and things. And only later on, when I was in my late 30s, did I start something in me said, "Oh, you can be an actor now." I started doing it again, right? So this is all to say that what I'm writing now, it just comes from my life experience in Rome as an actor, um, and a person inspired by Italian literature and cinema.
Mhm.
This book has been scary to me because so much of it's happening in fascist Italy,
Right.
right? So that's been like, oh, please tell me it's not connected to the future. Of course it is, right? I find that your poetry making self is usually 2 years ahead of your own everyday life. So
Yeah.
um, we'll see where this book lands, but it's certainly unusual there. Getting back to Horse Ranch, when I first did Beautiful Senor, I used to encourage my students to write about love and sex, but I'd never done it until it came to Italy, right? And I did a kind of bargain with myself, and I thought I was going to die in a plane crash, and I'd actually
Mm.
write some love poetry. Because what I had in my hand when the plane was tossing me around was like uh, little love sonnets of Shakespeare. Is
Mm.
all I had to clutch to. I thought, okay, God, if I live, I'll write some
I'll
love
do
poetry,
this.
right? So I see Horse Ranch as a continuation of Beautiful Senor in
Mhm.
that vein, like celebrating with rich imagery and craft, uh, same-sex relationships and marriage and encounters and people. So that's kind of the story. It's like a work created from old scraps
Yeah.
that began to sort of sing to each other and sort of glow like, oh, okay, right? Um, I'm going to read my only ever public collaboration with another poet.
Oh, I would love you to. Yeah.
Um, at one point, Brian Turner, who's known for his Iraq war poetry, not for
Mm,
love poetry, came to a lot of us, and he's putting together an anthology called When You Ask for Something Beautiful.
mm,
So he came to me and he gave me various prompts, and I chose one, and then we worked on this collaborative poem for about half a year. It's called Corsair, as in pirate Corsair, in collaboration with Brian Turner. Remember, every lover is a corsair seeking glory, and X marks the spot, a longing for invisible treasure. Every lover is an endpoint and a start point in the history of the world, a spark in the bright flare of the possible. Our swashbuckling lovers remind us, oh, once we were lazing children, housebound and shoreless, with no concept of the sea. But now there's the ocean's blue spool, fleet-winged gulls, wind-blown caravels, even spouting whales, crow's nests and clouds like a white armada. And so, when we relinquish the body's treasure map, our lovers discover us the way the sailcloth in the rigging fills with the trade winds, from the last of the night's stars through the lavish tangerine of dawn, our ships gliding over sheets of light glazed silver.
mm. It's just beautiful. I think it's really interesting how, these poems take place in these landscapes of Italy, France, Greece, Asia. And so there's a way in which they place the speaker of the poems and also the reader in this point of view of the traveler, right? So the adventurer, the seeker, kind of the outsider or the pilgrim. And I'm interested in how that sort of parallels that point of view of the lover, in a way. Do you think about that?
Oh, yeah, I thought about it just before we began this session. So, what I want to say is that the beloved or the lover falling in love is like going into a new world, right? And being willing to risk a new world and perspective that the lover or the beloved represents. Are you willing to learn? Are you willing to risk? Um, so I always think of it, I had to see Terrence Malick's movie, The New World, because I think part of why it was Rilkean and poetic was because there are moments in the movie where John and Pocahontas look at each other and like, who are you?
Mm,
Why am I drawn to you? You know, why you? It's just sort of great mystery, but it's also new landscapes as well. And, sometimes you fall in love with a person from another place, which implies the possibility of learning and travel and investigating. So that's sort of the realm of the book, I think. The title's super playful,
mm,
right? This idea that you could be, I mean, what I like about it is that it's not about so much about possessive love or jealous love for the most part. It's a sort of like, well, you're a busy guy. Can you make some time for me? Kind of thing. Which I think is sort of sweet. And I continue to travel a lot, and despite the fact that I'm a tourist, I'm a very vagabond tourist like Cher. I'm a gypsies, tramps, and thieves tourist,
mhm.
not
Me
a
too,
tourist,
by the way.
yeah, a tourist by the hearth, right? So yeah, I think it's a lot about the journey to the beloved or beloved landscape or place of power. Um, I was trying to explain to a lover of mine that I've been with for almost 18 years, and it's sort of an informal kind of love relationship where we were together recently, and I felt like I was more myself
Mm,
after we made love. I felt like somehow
mm,
I was more me
mm,
when I was with him. It was really quite paradoxical.
mhm.
It's the most I felt like myself in the past few months because I've been traveling a lot. It's just like, oh, all right. Um, that's the kind of mystery I think that's there inherent in this book. Like, why, um, especially if you're a person who's willing to go beyond sort of traditional notions of what a relationship is supposed to look like or be, or what a marriage is supposed to look like or be. In the past, the irony for me is I wrote this book that's full of stuff, and then this has been the most, since the time of the right after I wrote it and pandemic, this has been the most sort of celibate period of my life for the most part, because I'm not often home. I don't often see my lover or other people in Texas. So it's like, what, what's it all about, Alfie kind of thing. Sort of like, what is this all about? So I think I'm trying to sort of praise the mystery, but also remind people of the sacredness of connection, especially even if the connections don't last long. I think people really grew to those, what is it, before sunrise, before sunset, before
Right.
midnight.
Uh-huh.
The possibility of meeting someone really powerfully and then um, being the opposite of Taurus and not clinging to them and just appreciating um, what you can experience with people and how they open up to you. I have a few people in my life, even from the last couple of times I was in Rome that I met that I feel very close to, even though I don't see them hardly at all or in another part of the world or something. I think of them in a wonderful kind of way, like, oh, I'm so glad that person entered my life.
Yeah.
Uh, some of them are mutual travelers. You just met them traveling. And so it's that kind of spirit. I think you kind of nailed that part of it there. Um,
Well, it's interesting too how, I mean, poetry, it's hard to talk globally about or, universally about poetry as an art, but one of the things that I always look for in the poetry that I read is this opening up a new perspective, right? And how you're describing these encounters with people, even when they are brief, there's a sense that the perspective is shifted, that something has changed, that engagement or that entanglement has, fundamentally shifted even a small part of the landscape of your own psyche.
yeah, I'm sometimes surprised, like in a previous book, so it was a poem about an encounter with someone I had where we shared a sunset, right? And someone said to me, it's such an erotic poem. I said, oh, really? Because I didn't really allude to that element of it, but that was so much there in it, in the poem. And the fact that someone else could sort of have discerned that when I don't think I gave a lot of clues. But there's something about trying to describe such a shared experience so specifically that people can, also pick up on clues that aren't overt, right? So I thought, oh, was it really obvious that this was could have been an encounter? It didn't become one, but it felt like it was becoming one.
Mm,
It was one of those could have been, are we going to make love? What's going to happen? Sort of thing. But it also didn't go to that level, but there's still something very beautiful about the sharing of it and sharing stories and discovered that we both lost our parents and yeah.
it's an atmosphere of exchange, right? And
That's a
that's
great
what
way of describing it.
is created in every poem as well, right? It's that atmosphere of being open to, like you said earlier, that new experience, that new point of view, being changed, being moved by a sunset or by what a person is telling you.
One of the poems, it's a longer poem I won't read, is about the death of someone that I was very, very close to. and there was never anything erotic in a relationship. But when he died, it was like this whole
Mm,
sense that we'd had another lifetime together, and it was very powerful and very close and very erotic. So in the midst of my very real grief, it was like, oh, here's another way of looking at that. The person you thought you knew so well, like another facet of their soul almost.
mm,
Because this person is so famous, I really had to kind of like be discreet about it and say, oh, I had this past life with so and so. And it was really powerful. And we were like in the Crusades together and all this stuff. You know, it's not something seriously, but it was so powerful. It's
mm,
one of the first things I wrote. I started to write for this book because I was in mourning there. Um, I can't say this about my productivity. I have to thank my friend who was the abbot of the Christ in the Desert Monastery because he invited me and gave me a hermitage. And ever since I was on in the desert alone like that, and I had that incognito time, I
mm,
haven't stopped producing.
mm,
The level of my creativity has sort of like tripled.
mm,
And sometimes it's about, you know, shutting out the chatter and the clutter and all that stuff and being able to really listen to yourself. So I had that time in the monastery and also in Taos with the fellowship. They sort of overlapped. I
mhm.
would back and forth between the monastery and Abiquiu. Um, and then, you know, I'd go into town to Taos there. So there's something about, you know, just having time and space that we all need as artists and dreamers to hear ourselves and feel ourselves. Um, and being with the abbot, who was someone I knew from when we were younger, like 30 years before, was really, really powerful because he's always been a huge supporter of my poetry. So he sort of gifted me with a situation that really expanded me as a poet. And I gave some readings for the monks there.
Mm.
Um, but he was a source of great inspiration. As soon as I landed there, Christmas time, I haven't stopped producing.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it used to take me 3 or 4 years, and now, like with this latest book, sometimes even just 2 months.
Mhm,
In terms of this book, you know, I was again isolated in the winter in Taos, and with the book I wrote, I sort of corrected them and revised them at the same time. I was overseas, you know, I was away from my country, and I could talk about the gun violence in my country
right.
more clearly because I was away. So in the midst of even like a book that's joyous as this, there's something so important about silence and listening to your heart and as well as we're constantly taking in so much stuff
Right. Yeah.
all the time. And we as poets and creators, we need that time away from, and it doesn't have to be contrived or artificial or rarefied or whatever. I'm fortunate and I was given a hermitage. It doesn't get more dramatic or beautiful than that. And I'm a person who grew up in the Mojave Desert, so
Mm,
kind of a desert person. And
right.
um, I know that's part of my life circumstances that I didn't consciously have control over there. So um, I think this idea of exchange is really powerful and what people can do to even if they come into your life briefly or, you know, a long time. It's important that people get a chance to know you as well, if that's possible. So I've always been a very other directed person. You know, I've had 3 husbands or partners beyond the various people who show up in the book, right? So it's like, um, and I think pulling away and not having relationship stuff for a couple years has just been a good thing as well, right? To sort of like, okay, pull back. Um, I'm not created or uh, necessarily compelled by other people, but at the same time, I'm learning something about, it's a mirroring process. Part of
Right.
being human is is through exchange and through back and forth. And but I can't say, I have a lot of younger people in my life, and I can't honestly tell them that it gets any tidier, that love and sex and all that gets any tidier, because it doesn't. It's always sort of messy and doesn't arrive at the right time or whatever.
Yeah.
It's always a little bit of a struggle there to get to those moments of communion or just clarity about any of this stuff there.
Mm.
Since Beautiful Senor, I got to the end of Beautiful Senor, I realized I was talking about the beloved.
Hmm.
And I do think that the beloved and the path of love and sexuality and romance is a genuine path for human beings, and Eros is a genuine path. And our culture, at least in the US, tends to be more on the Puritan side. So I've had to hold the banner of the sort of sacred erotic and the sacred romantic. I see that as being part of what this book is about as well, but in a lighter mode.
Yeah. Yeah.
And laugh and joke about it a little bit, and laugh about the differences one has with, especially if you end up getting involved with someone who doesn't fit any of your bona fides or whatever you would call them. Like, oh, it's not checking this one. Oh, but why am I so attracted and why am I so here?
Yeah.
There's a lot of comedy in that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
As you
my
said.
first partner, I mean, I went to Stanford, right? My first partner was not an intellectual person at all. And as a young man, I assumed that I needed that.
Hmm.
I mean, in the course of our 10 years together, it got brainier and more, you know, of a book lover and whatever. There actually is a kind of exchange sometime. And I got far more social and much more confident around other people. I know it's hard for people to believe that I was actually rather a shy person, despite
Yeah, it's
my
hard for
acting. It's like, but once upon a time, I was super modest, and my acting coaches and teachers over the years worked hard to give me really challenging roles and things to get me away from that sort of modesty, like kind of part of myself.
It also
Oh,
makes a lot of sense though, because I think, what we respond to in a great performance by an actor or in, the remarkable poems in this book is that sense that there's what's given, right? The words that are given, the performance that's given, but there's a depth and an interiority that actually remains maybe somewhat unspoken. Um,
mhm.
that gives what is spoken its power. And it's hard to describe that, but I think we know it when we encounter it.
I think a lot of actors are kind of on the shyer side. A lot of people think you're in it just to for your, exhibitionism, but it's not that. It's a real soul search having to do, as poetry is, with being able to access emotion, which is, what life on earth is about. I think people who try and skirt or ditch emotion are like missing the point of being in Schoolhouse Earth. It's like this is a place to learn about. Someone said to me, the earth is a place of passion,
Mm,
which I totally agree with.
mm.
We're here to really learn to access emotion, and then of course all the signals we get, especially as men, it's to like avoid all of that. Rip your heart out. Don't go there. And there's no way to get through your life actually doing that, right? I mean, I have a stoic side, but man, the ability to access emotion through language or performance is is so much of what makes life great. It really does.
Would you like to read a poem that you think that happens in? I mean, the whole book that happens in, but
Oh, I mean, I'm super fond of the final poem because I think it's joy. It's sort of joyful and grieving at the same time. It could be more dramatic. The opening line. It's called I believe Icarus was not failing as he fell, which is a line from a poem by Jack Gilbert, one of my favorite poets. I believe Icarus was not failing as he fell. You've just died in my arms, but suddenly it seems we're eternal. Cali boys, afro-haired cohorts in crime, racing through intricate lattices of quince and lemon tree shadows, corridors of Queen Anne's lace. On this skip church Sunday, you dubbed me Sir Sirius instead of Cyrus. Then, swift as a deer's leap, were devotees of goatees and showy Guatemalan shirts, intoxicated lovers for a month on the northwest coast of Spain, praising the irrepressible sounds of a crusty Galician bagpiper on La Coruña's gripping Finisterre, then gossiping and climbing like the giddy Argonauts we were, the lofty ancient Roman lighthouse. All the way, keep on trucking, they sang, to the top of the Tower of Hercules.
it's beautiful. Um, so as you were talking about, this quality of love, the eroticism of language. Um, I was thinking of the poet Forrest Gander, who's a very different voice than yours, but he also came from the Mojave Desert
Mhm.
and has this. I'm not sure I'm going to do it justice, but basically, what I took from some of what he's written about his poetics is that sense of space or that sense of silence that you experience in a desert, or that just generally you experience around the phenomena of the world and the phenomena of language, that silence is actually part of what makes it erotic, right? That there's a sense that language itself can enact that longing one feels. So that's how he might think about it. But how do you think about language um, as potentially embodying that sense of the erotic impulse?
I've also been teaching Natalie Diaz's poetry and book, and she's also from she's a Mojave Indian. Um, I think that, well, because of there's some sort of sensory deprivation that goes on in the desert. There is a seeking for, um, call it oasis or whatever, and maybe a heightened sensitivity to physicality and to eroticism because of the spareness of the desert. I mean, I grew up with no trees, just Joshua trees aren't usual trees. I mean, you two made the Joshua tree famous, but so when I went to college in Northern California, I was obsessed with trees and things when I first arrived at Stanford. I mean, I was like taping leaves to my window and all of that. So there's something about the balance between sort of physical or sensual deprivation and maybe a heightened sense of the body and physicality as well. That has to do with the bright light of the desert. And it's not something I've thought of that much before. I mean, I really thank you for the invitation to begin considering it more because I think what was so remarkable about Natalie's book that won the Pulitzer Prize, her second book, was that her language I found to be more interesting than everyone else's that year. And it had these sort of qualities of intricacy and formality. I know that she's been responsible for putting together a dictionary of the Mojave language. But there's something about a desert environment where, it feels like every word kind of counts in some ways that are real. I would say my experience as a translator of Salvador Espriu was like that as well, where his language had been banned from public use, so every word felt really precious.
Mhm.
Um, but this is worthy of more reflection and contemplation by me. I mean, this is why I love talking with you because you're such a profound reader and thinker about it. So I haven't, I think by the time I was a grown person, I fled mostly as far away as I could from the desert and, gravitated toward water. I went to the Bay Area and I love the Mediterranean and love both the Pacific and the Atlantic. Um,
It's interesting too to think about that because in in this book, in all of your work, but in this book especially with you know, that the theme of love, right? Um, the language, the lyricism is like I can't think of another poet that is so deft with that lyric sensibility and sort of the like the lush quality of language. So sort of the opposite of this big wide open dry space. There's that sense of fluidness and
which is why it was
flowing.
so hard to translate Espriu's poetry and also to do the crossed out swastika because that's not my normal mode. See, part of what's so beautiful about Ellen Hinsey's introduction to my selected poems, it's called Cyrus Cassells, a poet, a lyric poet in dark times.
Mhm.
He's saying my natural ability is to create lush, beautiful lyrical poetry, but given the time that I'm living in, I haven't been allowed to do that all the time. And so she compares me to Yeats. I mean, fan me. She says, like, uh, what did she say? Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry.
Mm.
Because I start the selected poems with the world that the shooter left us. So it's like my most political poetry. My selected poems goes back to my first book. It's the reverse order, right? So yeah, that's my natural mode, is this lushness. But grew up in the desert. I'm African American, I'm queer, I've got a lot of complex dynamics for me to address and pay allegiance to. So there are times when the lushness can come in, like with this book, the Lorica book, and also the Italian book is pretty lush that I'm finishing up there. And then there are times like with the shooter book and the cross-out swastika, I really had to pare it down as much as I could and allow people to allow more silence.
Mhm.
That's when I started using couplets, which I generally use almost all the time now. I like having more white space and silence, but realizing for something as immense as the war and the Holocaust that people have so much experience to bring to the page. It's like the homeopathic version
Mm.
of it's like homeopathic art, like just a couple drops will do in terms of such huge challenging subject matter where there's so much pain and trauma involved there, right? So sort of managing these different parts of myself where I'm sort of drawn to trauma and catastrophe as subject matter, but also I have this kind of innate lyricism. So when my second book came out, Soul Make a Path is Shouting, what people noticed was that such an unusual combination
Mhm.
of this kind of lyricism and the subject matter, which in some cases was very considered political or kind of difficult, right? And I was pleased that it got compared to Pasternak because he's one of my heroes, my literary heroes there. But yeah, that's kind of who I am. And when I was coming up, when I came to read, Rita Dove invited me to read for the Library of Congress, and one of the people there said, "Well, what's what's this about your vocabulary? Where did you get your vocabulary?" And so many people ask me that, and it's just from reading. I never, I've almost never used a thesaurus until more recently. I thought, okay, you can try, you can look at this. But I don't go to the dictionary thinking, oh, I'm going to use this word or whatever. These are the words that come to me. And there's such a wide range of language, of words in the English language. We have far more words in our language than most other languages in the world, actually. We've
Mhm.
got so much language that we can't. And for me, it was all about precision. So he was asking me, like, well, I thought, well, I'm a person who knows a few languages, and there are times you can express something more, I want to say definitively in one language than the other. And if you're among people who are multilingual, you can switch. And it's not pretension. I used to have these pretentious friends that I adored in Stanford, but they come back from France and they kept slipping into French. I thought it was like the most pretentious bullshit. And French is actually sort of my favorite language and has been since I was a child, and I wasn't able to study it until I was like middle aged practically. It seems like that's the insane thing that I'm such a Francophile person and I couldn't get to learning the language until I was like 40 or something, right? So I'm just super sensitive to sound and language, and I try and do my best with creating, memorable language and memorable sound for the poetry. Um, those are definitely priorities.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think sound, I mean, the lyric impulse in general, but the sound of language, I agree. There's something, I mean, if I had to say for myself what, to me moves me in these poems, it is that incredibly precise ear and the voice that's coming through. I mean, I think you said earlier that was maybe even in your ear a little bit more down to earth, and working with these craft. But it's just, on the receiving end, I think what's beautiful about this book, about, poetry in general, is that I feel welcomed in the journey of it. And I feel welcome because the sound insists on it in a way.
Wow. The idea of welcoming is wonderful. It's not something I can be so conscious of or control, but I'm glad that you experience it that way. I mean, clearly it's a form of sharing, but I think if one has an open spirit and a true intention to share, rather than to quote show off, or it's the same with acting, performing, to
Mhm.
really share and bear witness to, in this case, a lot of the joyous things I experienced rather than the tumult. I mean, it's a book where, I was casting over many years of my life, and, having lost some of these people as well, was like, then the memories and the experiences become even more precious and sometimes haunting, but also consoling and sustaining, right? With people there. Um, it's funny how it all came together. It wasn't like I thought, okay, I'm gonna write a. I mean, I love the imagery in the title poem about lining up all your lovers and like soldiers and the army and all of that. That was kind of funny because the book is a little bit like that. Like, okay, line them up, and what's your conclusion about your love life or them, or besides, oh yeah, it's a mess, and you know the love is also a lot of, unfortunately, too much about projection or whatever, or expectation, or just limerence and blindness, right? Um, but again, the opportunity to look back and think about what the exchange is like and why. Here's an example, okay? I think we tend to forget that sex is a socializing impulse, that as children before we hit puberty or thanks to Kundalini or whatever, we don't have that impulse we're not driven outside of ourselves. Without sexuality, we don't have this drive for the most part to go out of ourselves and, to venture again into this new world and landscape of other people and figuring out what they could present to you in terms of, learning and connection, right? Um, so yeah, it's very social. It's not getting enough credit for the fact that it's through sex that we're socialized a lot of times.
Mm.
In a even in a spiritual way. If we didn't have a sexual drive, we'd be like content to be monks and nuns or go on, playing racquetball or whatever you're doing to pass the time. That's like an individual sort of sport or something like that. Not
Mm.
racquetball, but just like solitaire or whatever you were doing. Because there's a kind of contentment to childhood when you don't have that sort of physical drive to like, oh, I've got to get out there and experience it, life and sexuality and pleasure and joy there. So I hope that this book and Beautiful Senor can mirror some of that. I want to say positive complexity
Yeah.
because we have a lot of ballads and songs, but mostly, mostly we're kind of miffed in them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I'm gonna get what I want.
Yeah.
And these poems don't function in that realm for the most part, right? They're in some, I know that I'm thinking, they're in some other place.
Mm.
Like, oh, wasn't that interesting? Wow, like, yeah, wasn't that interesting? What a trip. You get to be my age, I'm 67. I was talking to a friend of mine, and then as the sexual drive begins to die down, you're like, yeah, what was all the fuss about? Yeah, what was all that about? You know, I go to a bar or a dance place now. I feel like I'm in like a blender. It's like all everyone's energy whipping around. I'm thinking, oh, been there, done that. Kind of like, isn't this wonderful? But I would never go through it again, kind of thing, right? So there's a lot. Again, there's a fair amount of I want to say irony, none of the Alanis Morissette kind necessarily,
No.
but humor comedy in the way things happen.
Yeah.
We're drawn to people. And my first husband and partner, I remember meeting him at a party and not liking him. Like, who's this guy?
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
obviously was interested in me. Like, it's like, and he was 15 years older. It's like, oh, who's this old guy after me? Whatever. And then it was super humbling to meet him in another occasion and find out what a wonderful, wonderful man he was. Enough for me to spend 10 years with him. But my initial impression was like, this is a
Yeah.
guy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, you
I think
know,
I think
being
poetry sometimes hits us that way too, right? Like we encounter something and it's just like, whoa, I, I don't know what to do with this, right?
yeah,
Or I like this. And then all of a sudden there's like it's like the blinders come off and you're like, oh my gosh, how did I not
yes.
pay attention to this before?
I realized now I had a girlfriend at the time, so that made it even more complicated. Like, a guy, what is this? What's going on here? Yes, I was the scandal of the town that winter. I had a boyfriend and a girlfriend. I suddenly had a boyfriend and a girlfriend. But that's what I mean. It's like having gotten older and having some distance, you can kind of sort of sit back and watch the movie or watch the Chinese clay horseman lined up. Like, oh yes, there was that, and you were there, and you were there, and you were there. It's like, wasn't that a crazy time there?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
hopefully, just have a good sense of, life is worth living and relationships are worth experiencing and trying, and even if they don't turn out the way you'd hoped, which is like a lot of the time, a lot of the time. But who would you be without these people and these experiences?
Right.
Something else entirely, really, right?
Yeah. Would you like to read maybe one more poem to close us out?
Um, Let me see. I think I'll read this one. It's called The Land Ho Kiss. This isn't the Ark, this cruise ship. Though in life we're occasionally imperiled, occasionally jubilant animals on a journey, not unlike Noah's recruited camels and safe-kept toucans. Our ship provided horoscopes to remind us we're both hard to budge earth signs, Taurus and Capricorn. So, how did the serene nighttime sea become our escalating desire sponsor? And Venus says, well, what have we here? White gleam, a busybody governess or duenna, stargazer, co-passenger. I know it's a matter of supreme kismet when I linger too long on deck just to listen and absorb your marvelous vintage guitar. The way my mother Isabel always relished Nat King Cole and Johnny Mathis. Confession. When I broadcast her ashes over the coastline's blue hullabaloo, so help me, I crooned, chances are. Night after night, between ports of call, the both of us, insistent Sherlocks, ready or not gossips, we banter until inglorious wolf's hour about our equally hurly-burly pasts, our make-believe fisticuffs and top-secret crushes. I even venture singing Simon and Garfunkel's Cecilia and the Boxer with you on a minor dare, my tenor to your baritone. Your part Welsh, part Métis skin, usually chaplain pale from Yuletide Montreal, has bronzed so thoroughly in the puissant sun, your upbeat Quebecois posse insists you could pass for Cuban. Under Cassiopeia and the leeward stars, your chance-taking lips on mine are dead sure, paramount and gorgeous, and your coppery flesh runs warm, my sun-worshipping Magellan, in this glorious precipitous land-ho kiss, this immense starboard ecstasy. Is this the end of figurative storms? Troubadour, dice roller, night raconteur, where will you lead me, like Noah's unerring dove? Now that you know, I'll follow.
Mhm. Mm. Perfect. Well, Cyrus, what a joy to have this book available to us. And thank you so much for, sharing about the process behind it.
Thank you. It's always great to talk with you. You're such a great reader, like I said, so perceptive and so um, wise in a lot of ways. And then you get me thinking, like, wow, desert erotics? Get to explore, right? Take care. Thank you so much.
Thank you.